So let me start by welcoming you all. Despite it being this time of year, it's wonderful to have this number of people. And I think what you'll find is that this will be something that will be an experience unlike anything you've had for the positive since joining SVP. Just to give credit where credit's due, Joan and I and Peter have been working on this for well over a year. And we had to go through a lot to make this happen. And a lot of this is really based on the feedback you've given us in your survey and in the different conversations we've had. This is geared toward what partners are saying they need. And so our goal out of this is to have all of you, we have pending investment cycles. There are various stages. Education is a little further ahead, but they're all in various stages of scanning, of deciding who to invest in. We're expecting a full-blown investment cycle in the fall, and there's a very strong likelihood that the Education Affinity Group will have one sooner in addition to having one in the fall. So incredibly timely that we're doing this, and I'm glad you can come. As far as input, you're going to see input from a number of different partners, and a special thanks to Mary Beth. She was working on a project we call Lessons Learned, which is something, again, partners have said, what are we learning from our past investment experience that guide us going forward? So you'll see that interwoven. Sorry she couldn't be here today. And you'll also find two handouts. So here you have the first one that starts as an outline, which you can follow along. If you haven't, please grab it. And then the second one, we've done all the slides. We actually had 2 slides since then, but you've got the gist of it here. So feel free to use these to take notes. And this is also going to be a very interactive process. So we're counting on your participation and your feedback. We're very fortunate to have Peter and Jeff with us today to give these presentations. Peter, I thought I knew something about his background, but going through his resume, I'm surprised. I didn't realize he had this much. So I thought he had a lot, but he had more than I thought. But so Peter, as many of you know, I always thought too, he was born and raised in Pennsylvania, just to generalize, but actually he got his MD at UCLA and became board certified in psychiatry and did his residency at the University of Pennsylvania, and then was also at Wharton. And in terms of background, he was at senior fellow at Wharton. And in terms of background, he's consulted over 150 organizations while running a private practice, so maybe there's a time management session he could help us with. And he's also a best-selling author, which I didn't know. And Jeff is the executive director of the Fund for Santa Barbara, and in his role, he has served on numerous boards, and he's advised hundreds of nonprofits. So I think calling on our strength as partners of SVP, we couldn't have 2 better representatives to talk to us about this important topic, how to become more effective consultants to nonprofits. So let me introduce Peter.
Well, if you're still applauding at the end, then I know we were successful. First of all, this is a really big privilege for me to be here today with you all. I want to appeal a little bit for kindness from you. I need kindness for 3 reasons from you. Number 1, we did not finally decide that we were actually going to do this program until 2 weeks ago. And for the second week of the 2 weeks, Jeff was gone. Where's Jeff? So Jeff just got back yesterday. So the very first time we had a chance to talk about this program in any real depth was yesterday. So that's the first kindness you got to show us. The second kindness is we have in the audience today extraordinary people. We have people who've had a lot of experience with nonprofit organizations and with organizations and have a lot of sophistication and a lot of wisdom. We hope that we can weave that together into a higher level of consciousness. But the program was not, we hope it's broad enough because we had expected a spectrum, but we expected a spectrum that would have the majority of people inexperienced and some that were experienced. We have a much larger group of you, which we're thrilled with. So we're going to try to do more of it in certain parts and cut other parts as we go down a little bit. And so to try to shape so we can draw on the maximum of what we have here. And the third reason for kindness today is because we only have a limited amount of time, and so we just hope that you will judge us on those things. So, do you have some words you want to say?
I am Peter's co-pilot. This is his design, and so I will be flying next to you.
And it happened because I had to design it because you were gone, right? So we sat down yesterday and decided. So it's no reflection on the relative roles or anything, just how it all worked out. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'm Peter Boyle. I've been in Social Venture Partners for 3 years, and then we'll just go around. You just say your name and how long you've been here.
I'm Sheila Wald, and I've been a partner since last November.
I'm Susan Thompson, and I've been a partner for 2 years.
I'm Tom Sloan. I've been a partner about 3 years.
I'm Claude Case. I was a partner in Phoenix, started in 2001.
Diana Ferrara, partner since January.
Dennis, we're a partner since January. Seth Streeter, partner for 628 days.
But who's counting?
Evan Apteker, I've been a partner for 3 years.
Okay.
Ken Saxon, about a year.
Peter Karoff, 4 years.
Susan Case, 2001 Phoenix. Kathy Johnson, 2 years.
Michelle Winter, a little over a year. Kat Apteker, 3 years. Danelle Stewart, going on 3 years.
Alexis D in a few months.
Now, Mitch did, by the way, I want to thank Mitch. Mitch has been a total yeoman. We've been back and forth, more cuts and slides and designs and forms than you can imagine. And he finally, I gave him the material for the slides, but he made them interesting. Mine would have been horrible. You would
Let's
have
hope, right?
fallen asleep with them. So that's Mitch's first slide. So our learning objectives is apply your consulting skills in a nonprofit setting, learn to be an active participant in an SVP due diligence process, learn to care while maintaining objectivity, that is, don't fall in love with the organizations we get involved with, and learn to gauge nonprofits, which ones are best for investees, receptivity to consultant relationships and input, sufficient infrastructure to consider the big picture, and openness to do things better and not just in it for the money. Those are our learning objectives. That's what we hope you come out of here with. What we would like to do is, we'd like you to form little groups of 2, if you would. Stand up, find somebody that hopefully you know the least, although you guys could do it back there while you. And what we'd like to do is we'd like you to have about a 3 or 4 minute dialogue and make a list of what you came here to learn. This is what our learning objective, but what did you come here for today? Make a list. What are you here for? Find somebody you know the least, sit down next to them, and make a list for us. Do it now.
Dennis, oh, you're already cleared up.
Top 3 or?
All right.
So how long have you been?
Sure. Why am I here?
I said I've been here.
Well, I guess I wanted to learn more about best practices for addressing chapters, how they investments that only get exposed to helping you here. Maybe it's 30 other chapters, I think it was by choice, establish one way. Better.
I never did.
Has all the answers.
Always been in other resources. To give us templates to work with, whether it's on government or succession strategies, systems, infrastructure. I mean, it's like, what are tools that we can use? Because there's certain things I know more of, certain things I don't, and if there's kind of a template to follow, then that would, I think, also make us more effective. Those are my two.
There's so much to learn about that. I don't know where to start. Seriously, I don't know where
Somebody else will just say.
So not just basing it on what they say the need is, but maybe being able to identify the need underneath it.
it seems to me from the beginning, the private world, you have a lot of time. So, use incentives to keep them there, and that doesn't mean that they're good, no good. But why do I want to do this? So, I don't even know how call people in any nonprofit, and they all work in other positions.
Okay, about 1 more minute.
SVPs that have been involved in boards and SVP are jobs, and I think all the projects our job is different than a board role. Our job is to listen to the board, listen to staff, and then to help them do the work. And also our job is not to do the work, it's also seizing the board or staff's role. So it's not really telling you what to do, it's hearing what they say their favorite roles are, and I like the idea of identifying the need underneath the need. And then to help facilitate them to take the next steps to achieve that stated goal. So, I don't know, it's your nature, maybe it's like very naturally a doer. You know, I like to okay, what needs to be done, let me get it done. But our job is not to do the work. So my skills, abilities are not of great use in the sense of what I do in SVP member should be, which is we're empowering them to do what they do. So you want to start a business, I mean, our nature, typically a lot of it's here. You know? It's like, there's a problem, let's fix it. Just like you're not fixing it, you know, we're here to listen. And then you're going to write them to help themselves. That for me was shit.
Okay. Let's start here. And why don't you give us one or two of your... Learn from the great wisdom of the group. Good. That would be pretty clear.
For me, it would be more learning about, because I'm a little bit commitment phobic, as some of you know, short-term involvement opportunities where I can still make a difference, but it's not like a one-year-long project.
Okay. I don't know if we're going to teach you specifics enough that you'll be able to actually have a specific opportunity. So So the course was going to be more about how to do the short-term stuff.
Okay.
So, good.
Oh, okay, so I know what Peter said, so what did I say? Oh, well, I can just talk it, I guess. I really came here to learn more about how to be a coach to a nonprofit. And to make sure that to learn how to know exactly how I might be aligned with one of those potential investees. If I don't have knowledge of that field of interest,
Mm-hmm.
you know, whether it makes sense for me to do that or to do something else, but I'm basically here to learn the skills.
Can everybody
of
hear?
coaching.
Okay.
And
So-
the other thing that she
Yeah.
said,
That she can't remember.
she can't remember, is that she really wanted to know what it would take to be a good lead partner.
To be a good lead.
Lead partner.
Great. So both of those we will cover in considerable depth. We hope that you've moved quite a ways along those lines. By the time you have.
Well, I was gonna have Peter go next, because one of his are kids. So, you remember what you said about the doers? The transition.
The reason I'm here, or what drives me to be here, is to try and talk about the point of departure that SVP has as a consultant.
Point of the meeting what, Steve?
Meaning that you're there as someone who is not the action, but servicing the action. Meaning that you're not there as the doer and the entrepreneur and the leader. You are there to help, and you are there to fundamentally listen.
Yes. And we will hit that in spades. We will hit that point in spades and show you what you should be doing in addition to just listening, but what else you should be doing and thinking about.
I don't mean to apply the type A personalities of bad people.
No. And so I was interested in the specific skills that would help us achieve both of their
And
goals.
we will be doing some. You know, there's only so much we can do in one course, but it'll certainly be skill-based and so forth.
And I'm very interested in just the coaching aspect and how to be a better coach and how to help people understand their own issues and see it for themselves. What we're finding, at least in my experience with this, is that we're dealing with some organizations that have problems but refuse to face those problems and simply turn their heads away when you're trying to persuade them that there are things that they should be considering. And what's the best way to
Yeah. Unfortunately,
you can't grab their cheeks like you do your children.
unfortunately, you put your finger on probably the most important, maybe, or close to the most important problem that we face. Unfortunately, we're probably going to have to do a whole second course to deal with it. So we'll touch on the leadership stuff. If you remind me at the time, just ask to say a couple alternatives about what you might do, just to give you a list of the kinds of things. I'll put them out for you, but we're not going to have time to really go into them in any depth, because there are very, very specialized methods to
Okay,
deal with
good.
that.
Well, since
And
I
you
did
cannot
early,
get
I can
caught,
call you.
you cannot get caught in the coaching role where you have no outside information, because you'll form a, a folie à deux, you'll form a reality that is distant from the reality of the organization and won't be helpful. That's a very central problem.
Well, Kathy and I have share interests in the same agency, and I guess one of my questions is knowing when to hold them and knowing when to fold them.
Okay.
Exactly.
I think we have to be realistic in how much coaching can you do? When do you say that?
Susan, I think we'll touch on the first half of that question, which would be, how do you, as you're going in, know what you're facing and what's likely to get in your way? I think we're going to have to do a second or do something more specialized to get real far down the hold them or fold them.
We have a real good case study.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey everybody, I'm David Kramer. Sorry I was a little late. I'm at the point where I don't know enough to know what I don't know, so I can't tell you specifics, but what I feel that I'm doing here is not so much to take a class like you might take a class in biology. I don't think we're going to learn answers to questions today. I see this as a process whereby you sort of open your mind to what the real questions you should be grappling with to provide strategies for dealing with the questions that arise as we go forward. So it's really about thinking about it, as opposed to...
That's exactly what we're going to do today. If we're successful today, you will be able, without effort, to think about things at a whole deeper level of understanding of what you're doing. We'll have kind of wired it into how you think about things.
Since that's exactly what we're doing, I'd like to say ditto.
You'd like to what?
I'd say ditto. I second.
Oh, ditto. Oh, I thought you were going to say I'd like to leave. I don't want my brain water.
He answered for me too.
Me too? You too, Gary? Okay.
Part of this for me is going to be more of how SVP works. But one of my questions is also about so many nonprofits have a complex dynamic between the executive and the board, and to understand how that plays into the consulting relationship.
And you are I'm delighted to hear kind of, when they get a book, what do they call it, when you set something ahead of time that's going to come, foreshadowing. When you're foreshadowing near the end of the day. So yes, and when we get to that point, which will come as a crescendo partly if it works and we get far enough, and if we do the things we need to do, we will be right in the center of that question.
I would just say I am interested in best practices that SVPI suggests for how we can best facilitate with the investments we work with, and specifically the tools that maybe have already been thought out and developed that we can utilize. And I'm also interested in how to tap into the asset pool of our SVP partners and how to get more engagement from them. So specifically, here we're going to learn best practices from SVP International, but then locally we have 70 partners that I think we can all be tapping more into. How can we get further engagement from them to make a bigger impact with the nonprofit?
I think those are great questions. How much we're going to do the international tools today, it probably won't be a lot. The second question is we have some of the most sophisticated people in the room here, and I think the dialogue will raise all of our collective appreciation for each other's skills.
Yes, I'm echoing what Ken said. It's how to navigate between the personalities, whether it's the board or the ED or whoever else is involved, which difficult enough in a private business, even if you're the top
CEO.
person, the CEO,
Yeah.
and you supposedly have power, and then you go into a place where you really don't have the power to say this is the way it's going to be, and then you find competing personalities. So I don't know how to figure that out.
We're going to be dealing with that today. We'll only get so far because we only have so much time today. We have quite a lot to cover. We'll be in it.
I'll have to echo some of the previous.
Anything new?
I have a little stronger statement than Ken. I was going to say not necessarily complexities between boards and management, but some of the dysfunction.
Can everybody hear?
The dysfunction that occurs between boards and management.
Yeah.
Related to personalities, but also with the turnover that occurs.
Right.
Nonprofit gets on a path, and
Right.
then there's a change, and they backtrack. And how to create that receptivity in the current board or transitional board to actually receive the help.
We'll touch on it. We're probably going to have to do a whole segment on board and another class on very focused on board and board executive director to really, get deep enough to probably give you everything you want. But we'll touch on it. Other new ones?
I'm just a groupie, and I receive so much energy from hanging out with you people that I came here to be re-energized.
Well, I'm happy to see you too.
One of the things I think I need to better understand is what characteristics would make an ideal investee.
That we're going to hit in spades.
Well, I've spent a lot of time on nonprofit boards, I really have, but being new to Santa Barbara, I guess the big question for me is, who makes a good investee? I mean, that's the whole thing, and then strategic planning, which is another, which we may not be able to get into, but you know, isn't that sort of what we're doing in the long run for them? Aren't we kind of trying to create their future? And
Can we hold that
Yeah.
question till probably the last 20 minutes? And you put that question out. Don't let us forget it,
okay.
because it's very relevant.
I don't think it was.
No more? Okay. Jeff, do you have anything?
I think this is a great list. One thing that overlays all of it is the differences of organizations through their development and evolution. So the answers to there's some commonalities I think that we're going to explore today, but I'd also note that what may be true for a barely $50,000 2-year-old organization is going to be different for a $500,000 10-year-old organization is going to be different for a 50-year-old multi-million-dollar agency with a professional hierarchy that's fairly well established. So,
Yep, no question. So we're going to be teaching you how to think about it rather than the specifics of all the solutions to everything. It's too much. I have some things then from you that I need back. We'll do this. We will try to get to your learning agendas, but I have several things I need from you. First thing is I would like us to have some fun. Can we do that? Can we make this fun? Can we laugh? Can we joke? So, because learning is much easier if the looser we get, the more fun we have at it. As adults, if it's fun, we learn better. The second thing is I need you to participate fully. We're going to be doing some role plays. We're going to be making lists of things. We're going to be, and I need you to take risks. Some of it may feel a little awkward. You may be asked to be a role that you've never done before in your life, you've never seen, you don't really know how to do it. That's okay. Just make it up. You're not being graded. No, you know, you're going to have an observer, but they're not really watching you to see how well you did it. They're watching the process of what's going on so that we can study the process. So that's what I need from you. You to be willing to take risks, get involved, and do the stuff. Can I expect that? See hands? Yep. People will do it?
You'll only be posting this on Facebook, right? So
yeah, right. Well, we're filming you.
Right. Small group.
Small groups. The third thing I need is the power to tell you where to go and when to stop without too much struggle. Otherwise, we'll be here for 20 hours. We're going to discover some of these things are so interesting and so deep that we're going to want to be staying in that topic area and staying in that topic area. And my job will be to say, you know what, we've got to move on. Can I have that? Otherwise, we won't get done. All right. Anything else?
I will only note that I know that this group has a lot of experience with actual investees, and so we just want to remind ourselves that if we need to be specific and use illustrations from real life experience to try to keep that in the room. I mean, as much as I'd love to say, you know, you should have heard what Seth Streeter said about you. I'm not likely to do that outside of this room. So. But if we need to use those specifics, since there is some really good lived experience here, let's make sure we do it and then just keep it.
Okay. Does this come at this point? Yeah, I have 3 concepts. This is a short lecture. This is your big intellectual moment. So, we are in the business of change. If you look at our mission, if you look at what we're doing, we're going into organizations, we're in the business of changing organizations. Which means we need to think about the situation we enter and the investment we consider from the standpoint of how readily they respond to change. Not just how much we like the organization, not just how wonderful an organization is, not how great their programs are, but if we're in the business of increasing capacity or producing change, we need to always have the filter in our minds about how is this organization going to respond to change. Can they do it? Do they want to do it? Do they have the capacity to do it? That makes sense? The second is overt and covert. In this field, in most organizations, in nonprofit, in many human interactions, there's a large discrepancy between what people say and what they mean, between what's agreed upon and what's actual. And it's very important that you learn to listen at both levels and observe at both levels. And I'm sure you've learned that already. I just want to make it permissible for us to talk about that. Between what is said and what is real, and how do you see what isn't being said? It's a little like Chinese art. A lot of the Chinese art or Japanese is about space. A lot of organizational consulting is what's not being said. It's being able to figure out what's not happening, what's not occurring, and not being said. And then I'd like to introduce a concept called the psychological contract. A psychological contract is a concept which represents the mutual beliefs, perceptions, and informal obligations between two or more people or organizations. It includes both the conscious and unconscious, stated and unstated, but what's the real agreement that the people are coming to? What's the covert, real agreement? Not what's written on a piece of paper. So when we do our plans, our change plans for an organization, that's the overt. That's what seems to be agreed to. But what's really being agreed to? It sets the dynamics for a relationship and defines the detailed practicality of what's going to be done at the real level. Psychological contract. Okay? Questions? Case one. So I'd like to see if we can, this is a hard thing, I thought it would be simple, get the most experienced people in let's see, we're going to have 6 groups, right?
Yeah, 6 groups.
So I need 6 of the most experienced people. Ken, Jackson, Seth, Streeter, you're designated. Who else would like to volunteer as a very experienced consultant? You, Mitch?
Tom.
Huh?
Tom.
Tom. Okay, you'll be one?
Sure.
Okay, that's 3. I need 3 more. Willing to volunteer. If you want me to volunteer you. Come on. Remember, you have to get involved. You have to be willing to.
I'll participate.
Okay.
I'm not the most experienced here, but.
Okay, good. That's 4. Pete, 5. 1 more. Great. Mitch. All right, Mitch. Now, you can't give away the cases here. All right. So if the 6 of you would come forward, and Mitch, you would get them a sheet that's the observer sheet. Should you 3 of you should be on this side, and 3 of you should be on the other side. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like to start with the foundation observers. And what I'd like you to do is tell us, we don't want to know this so much about the skill. Any way I can shut that off?
That was hard.
What we'd like you to do is tell us the basic tone, the basic, what was the investigation about? What was the process like? How did it work? What can you tell us about when a foundation is there investigating? Oh, this consultants, I'm sorry. When the foundation is there, what can you tell us about what was the investigation like?
Are you asking us?
Yeah, you're the observers. You saw this transaction. What can you tell us about it?
What I saw was it was a very sort of professional communication between
Can everybody hear?
a nonprofit executive who's very articulate about her cause and organization, and a foundation executive who was asking lots of very good questions. So I wasn't sensing I didn't sense anything that gave me a sense as to how the conversation would ultimately turn out or go, or whether they would get money, or whether the nonprofit would learn what it is they wanted to learn about the foundation. It was like these two people were in their roles. The nonprofit director was articulating their pitch, and the foundation, or the funder, I guess your funder, was asking really good questions. That's what
you saw.
Yeah.
Highly professional, the nonprofit professional was giving their pitch, the foundation was asking very good questions.
Yes. But I couldn't tell what was behind them.
You couldn't tell anything behind it. The covert was kind of all hidden. Okay.
Yeah, I would, you want them to respond to that? Or do you want me as?
You're an observer?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay. So with my group, I also saw there was some great questions that were really mostly logistics based. I didn't feel the real human, emotional connection happening. I heard, we want to make impact, but the questions got into budget, and tell me about if your employees are part-time or full-time, and tell me what your 3-year strategy is. So I really observed it to be fairly a left-brain conversation around logistics strategy, not about the heart of the need. Maybe that was understood before, but what I witnessed was very much a very strategic, intellectual conversation around the need, and the state funding has dwindled, and therefore we need to find a way to replace the void. And I thought the interaction was very successful at that level, but it wasn't a deep human connection that I witnessed.
So it wasn't focused on the human connection. It was articulate. It was focused on the need of the organization being generated by the funding. And did I miss something else?
Correct. It was based on funding, employee model, just structural needs and how those can be addressed
by the
funding. Yeah.
Seth, how much of that do you think is a function of having 5 minutes and being very driven, as opposed to let's get a cocktail and talk about your interests?
Oh, absolutely. No, I strained the bejesus out of this by shortening everything, making the roles. I want to make a point. It's not to do with how skillful our people are. This is about what's the natural process if you let it go where it goes. And who's the third?
But one thing I just want to say is, to me, I was trying to answer the last question, is what was the psychological contract?
Yeah.
Because they came to an agreement where she was going to make a recommendation that they grant $150,000. So it was very successful on that front. But as far as there being a psychological contract where there's this deep connection that they want to move forward with, I think it takes that personal heart investment that can then be shared and built upon to actually get to that type of psychological contract.
Good. Who's the third observer?
Peter.
Over here for the foundation.
Consultant.
Oh,
No,
sorry.
foundation. There's a third foundation observer.
Mitch.
Oh, Mitch didn't do it.
Look, the group I had was great.
Oh, you did?
Disappeared.
Okay, what was your?
First of all, I told this frantic with 5 minutes to try to do this. And also, it would be nice if everybody had 1 minute to read this, because neither of us had finished reading it when we had to start.
Next time I do it, I'll give him a minute to read it.
But I would agree with Seth that it was much more left brain than left brain, right brain on that. And so it was hard for me to figure out whether or not her vision of dealing with homelessness would be one that would generate a critical mass of partners to commit both emotionally and temporally what needed to be done to support this. So, we didn't get to that level, to that depth.
Let's do the consultant. These are the 3 observers. Who would like to go first? Now, what their job was, this was your job over here, was to find out whether you're giving a grant to a foundation. The consultant was a job where there was a consultant coming in and being hired or not hired by the executive director to work on with the same problem.
Funding problem?
The organizational problems, but the funding was part of it.
I felt like the ED was very focused, and it's actually similar to the other groups, very focused on the deficit in the budget. That $150,000, he kept coming back to that, and that was the most important thing. I think that the consultant tried to figure out what the strategic plan was, what the talent was within the organization. But the ED kept funneling, circling back to the money. And I think that because of that, until we got towards the end of the process, there wasn't an open line of communication. And so psychologically, there wasn't really that connection that needed to happen to open up the process.
So in a sense, at least on the consulting, it may be different here or not, but on the consulting end, there wasn't enough work on opening up the process to get a broader focus out of the ED.
I think that the consultants attempted that on different levels, but I think the ED kept coming back to the same place. And I suspect that often happens where the ED stays with that particular point of reference, which is the crisis, and can't step away from it to see a bigger picture and understand what the value in the whole organization might bring and a more creative way to approach that. And I think that's where the consultant was basically trying to get to, but it was hard to be effective.
Great observations. Next.
So the thrust of the dialogue was the same. The nonprofit needed money, was in a crisis. The ED was very focused on, we had the shortfall, but she came across as, everything's fine, we're just short of money. So everything's fine, we're just short of money. If you give us money, then we're okay. And everybody's happy with our services, we just need the money. And the consultant kept coming in and saying, well, we capacity build, we do other things, and, we need to know if there's a commitment to think about the organization as a whole. And then the ED kept coming back going, yes, that's great, but how much money would you put in? And so it really kept going, give me a handout, everything's fine, give me a handout. I'm a little bit closed from thinking broadly about the organization.
And their instruction was the consultant was there to get hired, not to give money.
Yeah, so this consultant was representing SVP though. That changes the definition. And as far as the question of who has the kind of power, in this case, the ED did not represent that she had any power. She had to go back to the board decision. So you go along this dialogue and then get to the end going, well, I can't make a decision. So I have to go back and we'll have to regurgitate everything over again. So I think what worked well and didn't work well is one, focus solely on I need money and nothing else. I think doesn't work well. And not being able to ask the right questions to open the dialogue, to get that communication going.
Not
So
knowing how to
having
change
this
it,
skill
not knowing
set
how to change it.
to create that openness.
Pete? Peter?
Well, I had the best two people. The fundamental tension between the consultant asking the question and the ED answering the question was between what I would call consultant trying to get an overall sense of the strategy and the executive director responding with probably more data and more content and more substance as opposed to the strategy question. However, the ED's substantive comments about the humanity involved, the population being served, the homeless population, what they were trying to do, data points, was really in 3.5 minutes excellent. So, the consultant's urgency though, because of the 5-minute clock, came through. So, that was a lot of it. But the overall process I thought was a very good one. And in this case, the ED did not stress just the money, stress what the money could do and what they were trying to do. And then the attempt of the consultant to say, oh, if you actually got 10% more served this year, would you want 10% more served next year? And then the consultant did swing it around to SVP, saying we can bring a little bit of money, but what we might really be able to bring are resources, human resources, and skills, and that was received well by the ED.
Now, does your sheet say an SVP consultant? The consultant?
No.
No. So we assumed it.
It must have been an assumption on the part of the
Yeah, because I didn't plan it that way, I just left it as a consultant. So what do you draw? What conclusions do you draw? Oh,
Tom one? Yeah, I was one also.
oh, you were an observer too?
Yeah, we.
Oh, four observers, right, I'm sorry. I see.
The only thing I guess I would add is, I saw that communication somewhat guarded. The executive director, seemed like he was kind of on the spot, and I saw the consultant, kind of asking the same questions and getting the same answers, but not really getting the answers he wanted. And, it was very professional dialogue, but, I didn't see it as an open, easy dialogue. And as far as the kind of power I was witnessing is that, you know, the consultant had the power of experience and the knowledge of, you know, different experiences. But the executive director really had the power of affecting the change. So there's a certain amount of frustration and tension that goes along with it. You know, the consultant, you know, can come in and say, well, this experience I've had, and this is what works, or what we've seen, which is, you know, is all valuable. But the executive director has the power to either take that forward, or listen to it, or take it to the board, or whatever. So there's a frustration on both sides. It's natural.
If you let me divide this temporarily, and I probably should have made it clear that I didn't mean an SVP consultant. If you let me divide this way, pure consultant, pure foundation, what's the difference in the two dialogues? You've heard the observers, you experienced it. What's the difference? You experienced half of it anyway. But you heard the observers from the other side. What's the difference in those two dialogues?
Well, if you're going to foundation, you're basically looking for funding, and they basically will say yes or no to filling the hole that you think, the hole that you need. If you're going to consultant, the consultant may try to restructure the dialogue and say, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? But
What we heard was that with the consultants, almost all of the nonprofits brought up money first, even though the consultant comes in with a broader, and is trying to get them to a broader thing, the issue of money is there.
State central anyway.
Well, it's powerful. They're nonprofits, they need money.
What else do you observe between the two? Yeah.
One of my thoughts is that the consultant might be trying to prove their worth and, you know, earn the job, if you will, where the foundation really is holding the purse strings and is more evaluating the ED to assess the need if they're going to relinquish funds to them. So there's a little bit of a different role there where one is trying to earn, you know, respect, and the other one kind of already has it because they have the funds and they're determining if the ED is earning respect.
Very different situation, right?
I would think they would both be looking for evidence that there has been successful use of the monies they've had in the past, whether you're a consultant or whether you are a foundation. Because for incremental money, you want to make sure that there's that incremental capital.
One of the nuances here is that some foundations want to feel as though their voice and their advice is heard. And thus, they want to walk away feeling they're not just providing money, they're actually providing advice. And that's true of some foundations in this community. Thus,
Including this one.
including SVP, absolutely. So therefore, the dichotomy is less clear.
What's the relevance of all this stuff? Excuse me.
You know, this may be an aside, so you're just
No, please, go ahead.
facilitating me too. But I attended a lecture for a minute, I can't remember who it was, but it was the they do financial advising, it's a national organization. One of the things that this guy said was that foundations, because of their influence, often cause harm to nonprofits because of their own biases and their own beliefs. And that it's a really double-edged sword. So I could understand why an ED might be cautious in deciding whether or not to take the advice of this foundation or to be strong, take money when they are going to be so strongly influenced. So I think it's a very delicate situation, yeah.
Okay, but, okay, Paul, go ahead, and then I want to switch it a little bit.
It strikes me from your descriptions that SVP comes in a very confusing role. We don't fit either the consultant role or the foundation role purely, or a board role, so that we are a difficult type of person for an ED to deal with, because we don't fit in their experience space.
Which one do you think we're closer to? The hired consultant or the foundation?
I think we're closer in our behavior to the foundation.
I think,
I'm sorry,
To the foundation.
I wanted to say, I think we think we're the consultant, and I think they think we're the foundation.
Because they don't know what else to think, because they haven't had this other experience.
I'm writing that one down.
Yeah, finally, we got, Jeff got,
That got me out of my chair.
I also think it has to do with the amount of their budget. I mean, when you come into an agency that has a budget of under $100,000 and you're offering $30,000, that's a big difference than when you go to an agency that's got a $2-point-something million. So us as financing agents varies with the size of the nonprofit we're doing. I think we've
gonna take one or two or three more comments, then we're gonna
So
come.
we're a hybrid foundation.
Huh?
We're a hybrid foundation.
Or a hybrid.
Yeah. hybrid
Which do they
foundation.
perceive
Either hybrid
us more
foundation or
as,
hybrid
though?
consulting.
Which do they perceive us more as? A foundation, when we start, as a foundation or a consulting group?
I would say more as a foundation.
Let's be honest, they're coming to us for money.
Yeah.
That's the danger, and that's the way to think about it, is if we were, if SVP were purely a free consultancy, would they be coming to us? Many times, no. If we were purely a foundation, would they be coming to us? Yeah. So, what they walk in the door for, if they see the other half of it as something, a hoop they must jump through to get to what they really want, that sets up a dynamic that I think a few of us has come up in conversation in the challenges of approaching as both consulting and foundation.
Just as an aside, facing the same problem, our colleagues in Los Angeles have decided that there will be no financial grants the first year. And that, as they say, separates the men from the boys.
I think one more comment, I think I'm gonna leave here because
I
of
just want to
time.
ask a question, if anyone who has served as a
Turn
lead
this back on.
partner with SVP has had an opposite reaction where the involvement of the partners was more important at the end of the day than the money. Has anybody had that?
We've had a somewhat experience like that, although I think there might be a difference between a paid consultant, how a paid consultant would be treated, and a volunteer consultant.
Sheila, Goleta Valley Housing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one more question, then as soon as we get this working again, I'll go on. One more question, the focus of when it's a foundation, beautiful. When it's a foundation, when they perceive you as a foundation, what do they focus primarily on in terms of their dialogue?
Money.
But what money, and what do they use to justify the money? Their mission and their programs, right? So one of the things you can tell you can use as a vehicle to understand where you are in that transaction, right, is to the extent that they're solely focusing on their program and on their mission, as opposed to the problems and complexities of their organization, you're in the foundation role whether you like it or not. You get it?
They don't want to show their weaknesses because they'll be rejected.
But I feel like, just in my observation, if and of course we're all doing this ad hoc, so we're not prepared in advance, but I think if we ask the right questions as the foundation or the consultant, right off the bat and say, I'm sitting on the same side of the table so we can really work together better and understand how to deal with this problem, I think if the approach is different, what's your grand idea? What have you always wanted to do? And and get them outside of themselves, you might start a more effective first
Worth a try.
first stop in the
Just the
relationship.
power of, I just want to, Jeff, you help me, the power of the money. I'll talk about it a little bit, would you?
Yeah, I mean, Peter referenced a second ago, one of the, there is no absolutes, but you know, if we, I know most of us know this if you look around the country, vast majority of funders are funders, not also advisors. And Peter mentioned that many funders like to feel as though they're also good advisors, but if they're not structured to do so, that's sort of an incidental role. And you know, consultants are a separate beast, and it's a rare place where they come together. And what tends to happen is it only works if there's a pre-existing or an easily developed trust. Because nonprofits are not wrong to be distrustful of foundations. And I think that's one thing to remember. Foundations have spent 100 years making themselves making others reasonably skeptical of their long-term commitment because they tend to jump around. Foundations tend to hop around and lose interest and want the next sexy thing. And there's been some good healthy conversations as of late about bringing the general operating support forward and some of the other things and about what is that right relationship. But there's a track record that foundations are not being paranoid, or rather nonprofits are not being paranoid and thinking that if they air their dirty laundry or they share their weaknesses with a funder at the wrong time, that they will lose an opportunity. So balancing those two,
I'm going to
really
cut off the conversation here because we really have to go.
But I think you also have had some successes of where it worked, and I think documenting, and maybe what Michelle said, of what is the opening or what's the entree that makes that work from the outset, aside from just the personalities and the mix you're walking into.
Well, anyway, so let me read a couple things from Mary Beth's study. I guess I don't have enough here. Mary Beth's report, she went around and interviewed all of us and all found the weaknesses and strengths and so forth of what we've done and where have we run into trouble. She says in the report, the most important thing is the relationship. Open, frank, respectful. This is what we've told ourselves, not just Mary Beth, but this is as a result of what we've told ourselves, especially with the ED and the board chairman. Watch out here, the relationship is always going to be based to some extent on future dollars. So need to disarm that to the extent possible. Second conclusion, I think the biggest lesson we've learned with Wilbridge and Casa Esperanza is that SVP not get enamored of the organization mission and lose sight of the organization's strengths and weaknesses. They sell you so much into their mission and program that we fall in love and we forget to look as a consultant. Okay. Paul is now going to give us a short thing on our standard investment model, and then we're going to take a break. So if people can get in a position where they can see it, and then we'll take a break.
Okay. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. You have the slides and then the 5 minutes allotted to me. I can't go through every box, but there are 2 slides here. One deals with the investment cycle. We've basically, this past year, altered this process. So instead of going through as part of our investment cycle selecting areas, by setting up our affinity groups, we have defined for this year 3 areas: education, environment, homelessness, and low-income housing. What becomes important later this summer is for each of the 3 affinity groups are going to have to help draft an RFP. What do we want? What services are we going to offer? So 2 years ago, for example, we said we didn't have the bench strength to really support fundraising as one of the things we offered. And we made that fairly explicit and limited our RFP, and we excluded people who came in just looking for fundraising support. The first and most important task this summer, in going through our investment cycle, is to really think about what our capacity is and what we're proposing to help people with and what we're looking for in the investment cycle. The first time people come in is what we call an investment seeker workshop.
That's where we invite in all of the EDs and board chairs. We try and encourage both board members and EDs to come to that meeting, which is really the first time they have an opportunity for a dialogue with us. As we go forward, while we're a little better known than when we started this 4.5 years ago, I still think there are a lot of people who don't know very much about SVP. What we did the second cycle was we offered sort of one-on-one workshops, okay, with an SVP partner for all the people who showed up. We tend to have very limited time window, and that's a chance to really sit down. We ask them to come in and say, okay, there's nobody else, because we found that in Q&A periods at the formal workshop, nobody wants to raise about their problems. You know, they're reluctant with us face to face. They're even more reluctant in a group to talk about any of their problems, particularly since they're, quote, competitors in the room with them. So we try and have private session with each of the groups who's interested in doing so, and that's an opportunity for the first really candid dialogue as opposed to fact sharing. We ask them to submit letters of interest. We screen those. One of the first sort of warning signs is if they've gone through this first process and the LOIs don't appear to reflect, okay, what we tried to indicate to them, that's the first sign of trouble. And I think in retrospect, if we had been a little more aggressive at this stage, we might have screened out and saved ourselves some time and energy and problems. What we then do is appoint several partners to work and lead a due diligence effort. Learn more about that organization. This is where the types of things that have been talked about in the last few minutes of really understanding and getting that frank discussion is extremely important. I think we've learned a lot of lessons about how important it is to understand the readiness for change and the dynamics of the director and the board, and whether these are people willing to change and people appreciate what their problems are, regardless of how important their mission is. Reiterating what has been done before. And I think the due diligence team is also responsible for working constructively with the organization to help them put forward the best application. A lot of grant-giving organizations say, here's our RFP, here are the criteria, you're on your own. Our goal is really to help them shape a competitive proposal. They're putting in time, they're putting in opportunity cost. We want to give them the best shot at this. I think the danger is that the partners who are involved in that due diligence need to guard themselves against being captured by the client and not being critical enough about what their strengths and weaknesses are. We had a few, particularly in the early years, we actually ended up discouraging from going forward with the full application, and one of whom decided to withdraw, appropriately so, because even though at first blush they were qualified, that didn't work. They realized it would not work very well. We get our short application in. Doing our applications in terms of length is pretty straightforward. They're short. We rely a lot on our due diligence process, and then most importantly, for site visits. All of the partners coming in need to, that they can, should try and participate in one or more site visits. This is where you get to ask questions and decide, is this a place you want to put your money? It's very hard just to make a decision on the basis of the written application, and I think that this has been an extremely positive experience. It's also an opportunity for the people leading the due diligence to identify partners who might be interested, having heard the presentation, participating. I think that's where we've gotten some of our best partner sign-up, has been as a byproduct of people who came to the site visits and were encouraged. So you want to get a lot of partners, if you're leading the due diligence, to come to those site visits, and then we make our partnership choices.
This year will probably, the first level of decisions will be in the affinity groups. In several of the past investment cycles, when I was the investment chair for 2 years, if we had applications that were controversial, we brought those to the full partnership. We didn't make the decision on a 51-49 vote at the investment committee, said we weren't fully representative of how the full partnership might feel, and we brought those forward. In the third cycle, we had some that we unanimously recommended, and I would say the partnership vote was pro forma at that time. Then the big work begins, which is working with the investees. One thing that I think I would recommend personally doing differently this time around, in the past we obtained lead partner commitments after we had decided to fund the organization. We started on the last cycle to move away from that because of some problems we had. And so I think this time it's the responsibility of affinity groups to get commitments from individuals who will agree to serve as lead partners, even if they haven't been involved in the process to that point. There will be other partner skills you need on these projects, but you at least have to have a core team who said, if we give them a funding letter, they're prepared at least to take the first year's leadership responsibility.
Has there been a number that has been the key minimum you would need for any of the projects in the past?
I think you need one. You need at least one person.
I hope one.
That's a key number.
I'm thinking 5 or 10.
I think it's a good idea to have two. So one, because of travel and other things, people can cross-cover for each other. And then I think having partners who are interested, who will routinely try to make themselves available, given their other commitments, but they're sort of on call, they're the bench. Depending on the nature of the project, maybe something where you say, I know I'm going to need some help. Mitch wants me to wrap up. Then there's a process that we go through of assessing these and getting people involved and going on. But I think the real work, right, to avoid problems is being sure that we pick the right types of organizations to invest in, and that these dialogues take place in advance. If they have the right preconditions, I think we can carry forward with our investment plan. I'll stop there.
Quick questions?
Yes.
On the slide before Paul, can you talk about, is there a, what you think would be the best practice in terms of how the numbers would flow, in terms of number of people, workshop, number of letters of interest, number of investment applications?
Well, when we first started in the homelessness area, we sent out 50, 60 organizations we sent letters to. We probably had 25 or 30 show up at workshops. We actually ran 2 different times so that people couldn't make one date to make another date. We ended up with 16 LOIs and then 6 finalists, from which we funded 2 technical assistance projects. There were 2 that we didn't feel we could make a commitment to, but we were willing to try and help move forward. One totally rejected it. The other, we used funding to bring in some consultants, and as we suspected, they went south a year later anyway. So our decision about not putting money into them was well founded, despite partner interest in the mission, which is why we offered limited technical assistance. We have
One
not
last
had
question.
many people in such
One last question.
I have a theory, which is it really means the flexibility and the creativity of the ED is what makes it possible for us to be effective in how we test them. There's got to be some.
That's a great question. We're going to end up near there at the end, and then I think we're going to need a whole one of these on that, on the whole leadership, ED, assessment, the whole, And if you all come back for it, there's a lot to tell you. There's a lot to teach about that. There's a lot known about that.
I have one suggestion from my experience. Talk to past board members.
Yeah.
And
That starts in-
and senior staff. At least that will raise
what the
red
issues are. But
flags.
then if you're going to work with them, there's more specialized stuff.
Yeah, but at the due diligence stage, talk to, ask
Yes,
for the last,
absolutely.
the people who went off the board in the last 2 years and senior managers who've gone to the organization. Nobody inside the group will tell you.
Paul, thank you. You did a great job
Right.
on a timely basis. And just want to show you on your sheet here that you have a whole list of the lingo we turned out to you, so you can study it at your leisure. We're not going to do it today, but you have all the lingo. All right? So, it's a break.
Makes you realize, wow, that person is ready.
So here's what I'd like to ask first, and in no particular order. And if you want to just say ditto that, you can say that. But let's get some of the markers for those of you that have had the experience of walking into a situation, or secondarily developing a situation where someone is open to some advising and some change, some consulting, and some process work of any kind. What are the markers that you identify with somebody being ready for that?
Someone who listens.
Someone who listens. All right, let's start with the basics. All right, what else?
People who are candid.
All right. Candid?
Forthcoming about the situation.
Forthcoming about the good, bad, and the ugly?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're objective and dispassionate.
Objective and dispassionate? All right.
We're just describing ourselves.
Of course, because that's who's right.
How about objective and passionate?
This is on Peter, those who see big problems will equal big opportunities.
Great.
That Peter, he always nails it.
Okay.
Reading the ED, or is there a spark in their eyes? How are they non-verbally? Are they seemingly engaged and leaning in? Are they removing or closing themselves off?
So
Body language.
ED body language?
Yeah.
Particularly between the ED and their board chair.
And what is the marker of ready for change? What's that relationship got to look like between the ED and the board chair?
I think they should be on the same page.
Okay.
Very fluid.
And when they talk to you, they shouldn't be talking at each other, but together to you.
Okay. Great. Yeah.
I'd like to add that they've got some breathing room, i.e. they're not in immediate crisis. I think it's very hard to affect change in organizations which are to the wall.
Sure.
Our doors are getting closed unless you get us on the house.
We spoke about that. We talked about it being timing. If an organization is just thriving, then there might not be that much receptivity. Or if they're too far down the failure curve, they might be too hard to resurrect. So you have to find the right spot on the curve from a timing standpoint.
Where's the places where they embrace questions and they're trying to focus on learning?
In terms of the timing, it's when they're sort of like a flex point where they're about ready to take off and not quite sure where they're going.
Maybe they've done recent strategic planning or express a need to do it, because that means that they're thinking about their future vision. And so they're open to possibilities. If they haven't done it in years and years, then
Okay.
there might be a concern.
Piggybacking off of that, if they had put some thought into what their challenges and pain points are, And a next step further would be if they already started thinking of potential solutions.
Right. They've attended a Courage to Lead workshop.
Right.
He didn't pay me, but honestly, would that not be an indicator? Potentially.
He's gonna pay you now.
Pay me.
I would just add, for those that are humble and take their self-interest out of the equation, they tend to be a little more open to hearing expertise from others.
Right. All right, let me just summarize, and just because I'm at the end of the page doesn't mean I want to cut it off. All right, so someone who listens, we're talking now, some of these are just individual characteristics, other organizational, but it's a little mix and match here, but listens, candid, forthcoming, objective and dispassionate, or objective and passionate. Can see that big opportunity problems can equal big opportunities. Body language of a leader says a lot, leaning in versus closing off. ED board chair are both on the same page, or at least communicating well. There's some breathing room. They're not an immediate crisis, so you've got some folks with a little bit of time to figure out what, as opposed to just, I don't care what else happens, I need to check. And the timing on this and other factors, obviously. Embracing questions, focus on the learning. They're maybe about to take off into some, they're growing, it's exciting, and they're not sure where, and they're looking for some guidance and some input. Recent strategic planning, or an expressed interest in doing some thoughts already on the challenges and solutions, so they're not starting from scratch, like they haven't even talked about it within the organization before they talk to you. They may have attended Courage to Lead. Their humble self-interest has been removed from the equation. They're sort of, I want to be of service and I want you to help. So I'm just reading that aloud because my handwriting is not always brilliant. Yes, sir.
When external circumstances have radically changed.
Okay.
That could be the funding, it could be competition, it could be market.
Right, so sometimes steady state within the organization, but in the context of a radically different external environment can be the either trigger and or readiness factor.
We came up with something similar, but it's, there has been recent change. Maybe it is internal recent change, like a new executive director, or change on the
Okay.
board. That's chosen up in this case, things we need.
Great. So oftentimes new leadership presents an opportunity. Okay.
Internally, when the leadership has been around too long.
When leadership has been around too long?
I think it's on the barrier.
That's what we were thinking. Do you mean that as a barrier to change, or that means they're ready for change?
Could be either.
Right. It might be the reason for the need, but it also could present itself as the thing that needs to be overcome before anything can happen. As you could see, yes.
I thought there's a minimum level of stability and they're asking the right questions.
Okay. Great. So does this all ring true? Either from lived experience or, yeah, it makes sense that those would be markers of somebody, some organization, right? Seem to be pretty consensus. All right, let's move to the other side of the coin before we jump into our next exercise and talk about the barriers. And obviously, flip side of everything we just said is an easy way to answer this question. But particular things you may have seen or experienced that presented themselves as barriers. And I'll actually start with the fact that this can go either side. Leader who's there too long, entrenched in old ways, etc. Big egos. Okay? Big egos.
Say success/complacency.
Right. So good at what they're doing now that they don't feel the need to change.
Overuse of the word term, yes, but.
Like that.
lack of,
Overuse of the term I versus we.
lack of leadership skills.
Yeah.
Okay.
Biggest impediment that I've seen is just weird interpersonal relationships within the agency that you can't see coming, but just smack you up on the side of the head.
I like your choice of the word weird. That's
You might
good.
You might add that the word culture.
What's that?
You might add that the word culture.
And what kinds of culture?
Weird.
Weird interpersonal. A culture of weird interpersonal relationships. Okay.
A culture where the board thinks it's the operator.
Or a culture where people are engaging around lots of things, interactions that have nothing to do with mission.
Staff doesn't feel empowered. Okay.
Program model out of date.
Great. So what worked 20 years ago, just not working anymore. Okay. So entrenched leadership, just not willing to change, big egos, success, so successful they feel complacent, like, nah, I don't need to worry about it, we're good. Yes, but too much of that, too much I, not we. Lack of leadership skills, weird interpersonal relationships and a culture thereof. Board that thinks it's the operator, also a cultural challenge. Lists, lots of work, lots of things happening that are off mission. They take time, people are doing them, but it's not clearly connected back to why they're there. Staff not empowered, program model maybe out of date.
Communication gaps.
Okay.
Time.
Say that again?
Time.
Time?
They think they're great ideas, they just don't have the time to implement them.
Okay.
Fiscal crisis.
Right.
I think one thing that I've heard over and over again is focus solely on funding and not on change. And one last one, leadership that's short-sighted, so they're only looking, maybe not too far into the future to identify potential issues and pitfalls.
Okay.
Lack of quality human resources people, both staff and board.
Okay.
To engage at this level of change.
Wrong people in the bus.
Wrong people in the bus. That's the other way to say it.
So, what is the difference between the list that you've written here for a for-profit and for a non-profit organization?
I think about similar. The difference is the nonprofit has an additional revenue source the for-profits don't have, and that's donations. Outside of that, they're in business
And the
models.
nonprofit also has the complexity of this volunteer board thing that gets all weird.
That makes decision making.
Well, there may be some differences, but there's a lot more similarities than most people, aren't willing to recognize.
And I think that, if I can just go editorial for a moment, I think that's actually one of the challenges that SVP in particular walks in with, and it's nobody's fault, it just is. And one of the things that I think we need to struggle with is how best to address it in a way that disarms it versus reinforces it, which is, you may be looked at as, I know you want to help, but you don't know what it's like to be in a nonprofit, right? And I know a few people have I've seen this actually happen already. And that, you know, just as businesses have this tendency to say, you know, nonprofits need to operate more like business, there's a resentment of that on the nonprofit side. And sometimes very rightly so, which is, well, you just don't understand the difference. And I think it's true to say it's 90, I'll make up, but 85.6% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So there you go. Let's say it's that. But it's largely operating, it's still people running organizations, and that's true. But the two layers that were just named, one is the volunteer board management, which is a different kind of dynamic than you find in most for-profits. And the second is, and this was, and Ken might be able to help me here, there was a great article in Stanford Social Innovation Review about the sort of encapsulating that a for-profit is largely making the thing that is its income source. You know, if you do that right and you market it well, you've done it. Whereas there's this extra layer of income that you need to find when you're doing it the nonprofit way. It's not always that you're selling your service, your work directly, and it's sometimes an extra layer of work. So those two sort of structural differences sometimes lead to that gap. And I think those of us that can overcome that is where we become successful. If you can acknowledge and say, yes, and here's a way to deal with that. Yeah, Paul.
Two comments, then we're going to have to go on.
Listening to this, I had a challenge many years ago in trying to get cancer specialists to use computer systems we were giving them. You know, there we were, the funder, they had obvious problems because lots of errors occurred. And we struggled in getting adoption, getting it used. And a political psychologist on the MIT faculty gave us a test instrument which turned out to be highly predictive of success or failure. And it was essentially tests of rigidity and dogmatism. Very distinct from people's professed interest and belief. Okay? So a chief of an oncology clinic said, oh, this is wonderful, et cetera, but then he personally didn't use it. Okay? But it turned out he tested very high on his personal rigidity. And I've often wondered whether, you know, it was so predictive across a large number of doctors and nurses.
You've just unwittingly foreshadowed our next exercise.
Yeah, you did. Thank you, Paul.
All
I'll
right.
pay you later.
I'm assuming unwittingly, because you guys did. Okay.
No.
Yeah, we're actually going to go right into that in a second. That's a great point. Was there another comment on this?
Just in terms of the barriers to change we've expressed, or from the organizational perspective.
Yes.
Are we going to talk about the barrier that we represent?
There we go.
Are we going to go into that?
Only a tiny amount.
A tiny amount, but we're going to start with this exercise
I
of...
think you just touched on it.
Right. We're going to talk a little bit about what we bring to the table and why sometimes matching our personal styles to the organization's style and history is as important as anything else that's about technical skill or qualification or anything else. And Peter's got an exercise that he's going to start us down that path.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
What do you think? This was really...
No. I just want to see if it would be possible to take a snapshot of that, because it's such a...
And I assume something before that. I'm actually going to transcribe these and send them around, but yes, you can be all high-tech if you want.
No, that's okay.
His handwriting.
If you have that software that'll translate a picture into a, you know, all right, consulting and change. Why focus on resistance and capacity to change? Is that obvious now? Lessons learned from Mary Beth Hardy. Key factor in the SVP investment relationship is not only the attitude toward change, but the capacity to change. Make sense?
Yep.
All right, lessons learned, more quotes. It's a really balancing act between helping and being a nuisance. In other words, we need to be incredibly respectful of their time, priorities, and not our priorities. Second, compare mental wellness and Willbridge. In mental wellness, you see a former ED that was smart enough to know she had a big problem and open enough to explore the solutions. Willbridge, you had an ED who had no interest in changing the way she ran the organization or growing her management capacity. Willingness to learn. Who said willingness to learn? Ken, I think it was willingness to learn. One more quote. A key factor in the SVP investment relationship is not only the attitude towards change, but the capacity to execute change. In the case of New Beginnings, it was very difficult to effect too much change in year one. Since they were so lean, they hardly had the time or the people to meet the capacity building. Okay, anyway, so those are some of the conclusions. You can see why they're there, right? Why they make sense. Unfortunately, today, we're not going to have time to do this questionnaire. You have it in your packet. And so I'm just going to mention it to you. I don't know if it goes on here. Is it still there? No. So I'm just going to mention that you can take this sheet that you got. You have it in your packet? Everybody have it? And when you have time, these are the 5 things that come from SVPI that are the key things that consultants need, the key personality issues, the key skills you need to develop. We were going to do a little exercise on it, but we're just running late. Okay? So you can take it, and the way I'd suggest you do it is answer it twice. Once, how you see yourself, and 2, how you'd like to be. And where there's a gap between those, focus around what you need to do to change. You with me? Everybody find it? Okay.
Peter, do you want to just talk through, I mean, that's a key piece of sort of the question of, do you want to just even say it out loud before we move on?
You mean the 5 of them?
Yeah, just talk through a little bit.
You want to do it? Why don't you do the 5 real quick, and then we'll go on, because well, we really need to go on, and we won't get into the case study.
All right, well, then I get my paper back.
Here.
I'll take it. So, I mean, this is to the point that Peter and a few folks have just made, is that so often one of the challenges that organizations have is that it's the messenger-message dilemma. Is that you may have all the competency and skill in the world, but if they're not going to hear you, and you can't deliver it in a way that it's going to be absorbed, then it doesn't really matter what you bring. And so very often it's a lot about who we are and our styles, and that's why choosing the right team, the right person, the right lead, or even the right combo is half of the struggle. And oftentimes, in a consultant relationship, purely consultant relationship, that's often what folks are interviewing for. It's not always just what's your resume. It's, do we have a chemistry? Can we work together? Do you hear us? Are you willing to roll with whatever our version of crazy is in our organization? Because every organization has its own sets of relationships. The self-awareness piece obviously is a big one on here. So that's just about, when I start talking in this way and I'm getting really fast and kind of agitated, am I aware of that? Can I shut myself down? Can I step away from that for a second? Or am I the upper end of the spectrum? Am I too quiet or too gentle? And can I tell that my audience isn't going to hear it unless I get really specific? Or do I need to write it versus say it? Or do I need to ask a third person? What is it they say? An expert is anyone who comes from 150 miles away, right? So maybe it's just because we're having this conversation, we've been doing it for months, that I'm not the right one to tell you this difficult thing, and somebody else has to reflect that back to you. So a lot of those things are sort of that. It's the emotional intelligence, the self-awareness piece. Obviously the empathy, and this comes from one of the advantages of having walked in the shoes of, if you're a former board member or a current board member and you're talking to board members, you got the street cred immediately, and that's one of the key factors, obviously, for someone to hear what you have to say. But it's also just the empathy, like, yeah, I've had that same experience, I get it. Whereas oftentimes this barrier that comes up from the for-profit, non-profit perceived difference, whether it's real or not, is that, well, you don't know. You haven't walked in my shoes. You don't realize what it's like to be responsible for X hundreds of thousands of dollars in budget, or whatever it may be. So some of that pushback that we would get as SVPers comes from that perceived lack of empathy or understanding. Obviously the flexibility piece, we don't have to talk a lot about that. Those of you that have done this know that sometimes an organization that's just scrambling to do its basic operations, just the ability to move on a dime from this to that may be the answer, and we just put this off till next week. The last two, curiosity is just, do people believe that you're really interested is a lot of it. Are you really curious about the organization, the work? Are you willing to learn something in the process of being a good advisor or consultant and not have to always be the one that has the authority? And then the last one is the tolerance for ambiguity. This is one of my favorites. You kind of got to love it, or it's going to be real tough. Because so much of this is undefined when you walk in the door.
For a long time.
For a very long time, yeah.
Should it be self-evident that being a 10 on all these is a good thing in all situations?
Yes.
Well,
mostly.
Really? I mean, I can imagine certain situations when flexibility should be diminishing as you move along.
Flexibility and change. I mean,
Yeah,
you
I-
have to be also be able
It's
to
a
stand up for
sequencing.
something.
Yeah, I think it's capacity for these, but not being a 10 at all moments at all
Yeah.
audiences. I think you're right. No, I think it's true to say that.
And we're gonna, one more comment, and we're gonna have to move on or we won't get to the case.
Thanks, Peter. I just thought we
No,
could
thank
at
you.
least have a conversation.
Thank you very much. One comment, last one.
Just throw an oar in the water for the notion of listening,
Yeah.
Yes.
which could fit under empathy, but is huge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Empathy or curiosity, it is. It's about being willing to ask
Now, I
questions.
need a
and getting
chart,
the
Ted,
response.
to do one quick lecture here. You're gonna need this for the case. So, it's on your sheet, but it's not outlined on your sheet. Oh, 90%, this is one more quote out of Mary Beth's study. Just to echo what you're saying, Peter. It's 90% of what we should be doing is asking questions. Not versus providing solutions. And the most important question of all is how can we help? So, I want to talk about 4 short lecture on social systems. We're going to get into, I'm a systems thinker and a social systems thinker, and so I'm just going to teach you a tiny amount about social systems, a tiny vocabulary, but it will help you with the case. There are 4 kinds of groups. There's a fragmented group, if you just think about groups, and a fragmented group means there's no bond between any of the people. If you start out with somebody, all of whom are strangers in a room, that's a fragmented group. They have no bonds. There's no pre-arranged structure there between them. The next one is an aligned group. This is what often you're trying to get to in organizations, where the organization is aligned with some direction, the people are bonded together and they're aligned towards some direction. The next group, and I'll hand you, these are very simple, but people don't think this way. The next group is what I call subgroup detached. You have alignment over here, but you then have also alignment over here, and they're not connected. And the last one is an oppositional group. It's the same as this group, only it's negative to the norms or direction of the organization. So you have frank oppositional structures. Okay? One more just term, and then we'll get into the case. System boundaries. An organization has a boundary around it, just like a cell has a boundary around it. And every time you go from one unit to another, or one part of an organization to another, or one organization to another, you're crossing a boundary. Every time you cross a boundary, it is wide open for misunderstanding, attribution, communication problems, power issues, anytime you cross a boundary. So if you have a board and you have an organization, there's a boundary between those. Be very, very curious about boundaries. Okay? So can we get let's get groups of 4 set up. All right. Well, what do you think? Was it interesting?
Claude should have been on the stage.
He is, all the time.
Did you have fun?
Yeah.
It's a tough thing, huh? So let's do the observers. Let's start over here.
So I was the observer, and I'll just pick out a couple of questions to answer. How much trust is there toward the SVP consultant lead? I would say a lot, more than I realized, in terms of him being authority and knowing a lot about nonprofits. And he was sort of the recipient of torpedo questions from the ED and the board president, and there wasn't a lot of time to talk about the 30,000-foot view or long-term plans. It was like, how do we get our board members to donate more money, and how do we solve this problem? How do we, all I'm doing is writing grants, and we need to hire someone to do that full time. So it seemed more like a, what do you call that? Like a arsenal of shooting. Yeah, maybe like a shotgun. Yeah, rapid fire. Yes, approach. Kind of a lot of reliance on SVP to solve all of these problems in a very short period of time. And a lot of dialogue went on between the board chair and the executive director, kind of back and forth. Well, what about this? Well, what about this? What about this? So sometimes the SVP person didn't even really have a chance to say anything. It was more about that was the power thing that was going on. And then there was a lot of focus on board development, which I think we said earlier today is not a core competency of SVP. Did we say that?
No.
That's not what we said.
Okay. Never mind. I retract that.
We did board, right?
Oh, fund development.
Oh, fund development, no, we,
Early on, we said we weren't going to do fund development, but I think we did.
Yeah. Good, very good, excellent, excellent. Next.
I'm good with over here. So I thought the conversation went really well. There was a lot of open communication. The SVP person asked a lot of questions, opened the dialogue. Do you think about this? Do you think about that? Which caused an additional conversation between the ED and board chair. The ED seemed very open to not we need the money, but what can we do to change? So seemed to replicate some of the ready for change characteristics. There was some covert things that came up where the ED thought that they had the right team in place to be able to affect whatever changes needed, where the board chair brought up having a third party come in and reevaluate whether we had the right team or not. So there's a little bit of disconnect there of perhaps their underlying agendas, but they seem to have trusted each other at some level, and relatively quick conversation where if I saw this in real world, I think, okay, this was the right representation and conversation I would like to see in that kind of meeting.
Good, excellent. Next observer.
So ours was a fundraising development type scenario, which I thought was kind of interesting given where we come from again today. So I had really the same comment as to that. And the team here, honestly, these guys are all outstanding, so they know what they're doing. It's hard for me to pick up anything, but a couple of general comments. One is there was very little what I would call just sort of open space probing from the SVP side. I think SVP consultants in general, we should try and ask open-ended questions if possible to look for issues that might be going on in the organization that we're not aware of. And I didn't see any of that. It was very specific. And it's okay to ask specific questions, but at some point you have to kind of put up this trial balloon and then just listen and see if you can hear what's coming out so that the unspoken things might filter through. There was none of that. There was also no discussion about the general development and fundraising strategy. It was all very much focused on this one program, this one project, which is 20% of the overall budget, but the 80% actually didn't get discussed at all, which I thought was kind of interesting because, obviously there's more potential for stuff there. I was having this conversation with Seth earlier about body language, so I was watching the body language of everybody involved. That was pretty interesting. I recommend everybody do this exercise. Just look at body language. Not to pick on Ken or anything, but he looked kind of a little bit out of energy. And it might just be it's the middle of the afternoon. They haven't had coffee yet, but it was kind of interesting to see that as something that I suggest people think about, like just physically what's going on in there.
Excellent. Last group.
Oh, okay. Well, I have to tell you that this group really did role play. I mean, they took on these roles, and like I could see that they were really being dramatic. This group, I mean, and humorous.
Well, you're standing,
and
so that tells us.
It was just great. I think they were, having a good time. But the SVP consultant was really terrific in dealing with both the personalities of the ED and the board chair. And I had to stand because I speak louder if I'm speaking stuff. But plus this guy's tall and can't see. But to get back to the actual question, just to give you an overview of what was going on, The SVP consultant introduced herself, and all of the questions were terrific. But there was clearly tension between the ED and the board chair. And the ED was, strapped for time, so any suggestion that came along, it's like, how are we going to do it? I'll put it on my list. I mean, it's really terrific role-playing. And the chair, there was really no interaction between the two, except the ED initially said, oh yes, we, the chair and I, we've been working together 5 years, he's a good guy. But that was like the only interaction between them at all. They weren't on the same page on any kind of program. I would say that there wasn't a lot of trust, and it was really not so covert. I mean, it was really surfacing some of the strain between them. I mean, that's why I wish I'd had a video camera. The SVP consultant was so staid and level throughout this conversation, acknowledging everybody's situation and making great suggestions and talking about how the consultant, how all the talent that there is at SVP, and so the board chair, wanted to know more about that, wanted to know what they knew, if they knew anything about not-for-profits. It was very entertaining to me. But I think that if I were to go down these questions, I would say that definitely the trust in the SVP consultant really grew, I felt, as the conversation progressed. I think that it looked like the ED's agenda was that really, the board wasn't doing their part, and that his staff was being criticized, and he had to defend the development director who had been really had a lot of experience, and there was no understanding of there was little understanding on what the board should be doing versus what the ED should be doing in this one particular area is one reason. So I was just really impressed.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. All of you, I applaud all of you. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is those of you who would be willing to read their sheet for the ED. Who has a sheet for the ED that they'll read? We'll give you what you didn't get.
The whole sheet?
No, just not the situation, just what we told you about the role.
You are a strong and vital leader to this organization. You have been here for 5 years. The organization has done quite well under your leadership. With the advent of the term of the new board president, you find that you just don't see eye to eye. In your view, she lacks the leadership skills to run a good board at this vital time. Other board members have come to you saying that the board chair needs better facilitation skills, and that the meetings are not run effectively or efficiently. Your priority is to develop a culture on your board where board members shift their focus away from events and see themselves as playing a critical role in identifying and developing more individual donors. The board does not appear to be cohesive. Instead, the board president and 2 members of the executive committee, along with the ED, are making all the decisions and not including the rest of the board. And then at the bottom it says, note, at no time can you allow overt conflict to be visible to the SVP consultant, because that would almost certainly eliminate any chances of their involvement. Also, you don't want to alienate the board chairwoman, because you will have to work with her over the next year and a half.
Can we get a board chair, Red?
Yeah, I'll do it. You took over the presidency of this board for a 2-year term 5 months ago. The organization has done well over the last couple of years, but is now facing the potential economic crisis as certain grants expire. The ED wants to shift responsibility for fundraising away from, in your opinion, a failing development director and onto the board. You hear rumors that she is critical of you. You are meeting today with a consultant from SVP to consider your organization for a capacity building grant you badly need. Note well, at no time can you allow overt conflict to be visible to the SVP consultant, because that is almost certainly would eliminate any chance for involvement. Also, you don't want to alienate the executive director despite the bitter divorce that you despite the bitter divorce you went through 3 years ago. Because you don't have
I didn't write that in.
Well, that really wasn't there.
Oh,
We didn't want Tom to know.
All right, so let me ask you briefly one quick question here. If you were to say on this typology, what kind of board is it?
It's the one in the bottom left.
It's not necessarily anti, but it's a subgroup detached, right?
Yeah.
Did we get that? Did we figure that out from what our interviews? No. And how about the interface problem between the system levels? Did we get that? Between across the boundary, Did we get that? Document that well?
No, because we were avoiding conflict.
Right. So what should we have done to get it? And what did nobody? You're all going to get mad at me when I tell you the answer. You're all going to get mad at me. You ready? I'll get ready for these to get really, really mad at me. Okay. So what should you have done to get the answer? What would happen if you confronted the ED?
In front of the SVP.
You gotta listen to what's not being said.
One, you got to listen to what's not being said. But what should you do? What simple things should you do? Separate them.
Yeah.
Talk to them separately.
I'd like to add to that, because my key takeaway from that exercise was the social venture lead partner should, the champion needs to be the ED who's responsible for the implementation. If the board is the champion for the lead partner, it's going to look like disruption or covert manipulation, right? So there really needs to be an affinity and a desire from the ED who's the champion for social venture partners to step in. Now, I mean by the ED, I mean the person in charge of the
But what happens if the board then is polarized with the ED, and the moment they're the champion of the ED, now you can't get a relationship with the board president?
That one I would give a higher probability of success than the other way around.
It raises the issue of who is the client.
Yep.
Is the client the ED? Is the client the board chair? Is the board? And I think that's a question to ask. Who do you want to be the client if we're going to come in here?
And then, you know, guys, we're starting to run late here, and a couple more questions, and then we're gonna have to do one or two quick things. And yeah, I know. I don't want people to.
I just want to comment on what you said, Peter. Several years ago, we did separate. We had a meeting with 3 board members separate from the ED, and one of the board members said, "I don't think it's a good. I don't think we're ready. You know, we're having some conflicts with the." And I said,
remember that?
Yeah, you know, and Paul, you were there.
Yeah. Yep.
And I thought it's just that don't let them try to con you together.
No, you can't do that. You can't do that. All right, guys, 2 more quick things, and we're out of here. Okay? There's a. We can. Oh, where is it?
So you didn't ask the question.
What's the question?
Is the board more important or the ED?
You have to come to the next class.
It always depends on who has the power.
Assumption A,
Because it's
I won't
the
even go this.
organization that's.
We'll just go right by this. You have it in your thing.
It's actually who oversees implementation.
Okay.
Ooh.
Isn't that beautiful? All right. These are the kinds of courses that we're thinking of running. Is there anything that's not on this list that we should? I think there's probably something about ED styles or leadership styles, right? Is that up there? Should be. So ED styles, right? How to work with an ED around their style. Is there anything else we're missing up there for next courses?
Ways to measure.
Ways to measure. We getting these, Mitch? Ways to measure an ED.
Sure, Mitch will do that.
No.
I got it.
Mitch has been so helpful through all this stuff. I apologize. Anything else? I'm just trying to get us out of here.
I'll come back to it. It's not on your list, but it's really how to use the skills inside the partnership.
How do you what?
How to use the skills inside the partnership more effectively.
Right, okay.
I
How do we draw on each other's skills? I agree.
That's our number one challenge.
Okay.
Is
So,
there a documented matrix of skills within?
No.
Okay.
so let me ask this question. How many of you would be willing to come to another course if it's in an area that you're interested in going through? Okay, great. So we're interested in continuing to learn. Now we've got to figure out what the next piece should be. Is it, let me try just one or two test cases. Is it working with executive directors? How many would say that is the next thing? How to take somebody's style and work with them and change it? How many would that?
What are the options?
Well,
these are the
all the other ones we said.
Okay, could I just make a
Yeah,
suggestion? Some of
please.
these are conducive to class, and some are more conducive to coaching.
Mhm.
And for example, working with an ED, that seems more like a coaching.
Well, I think we have to learn some fundamental tools that I don't think anybody in this room's ever seen about how you cannot coach a person by and large into a better style.
No, I'm not saying coaching the ED, I'm saying coaching the partner
Working with them.
to evaluate the
Yeah.
ED.
All right. Maybe
I'd
so.
suggest some of those types of things be done when we start the next investment cycle. Because I think they bring it to reality for people involved.
Yeah, we won't do anything
Much better
between now
than
and
doing
then,
it in
probably.
the abstract.
Be summer. Okay, last thing, do they have the evaluation sheet in their packet?
Yeah.
Would you mind just taking 2 minutes and evaluating this course for us, please?
Peter, just one thing I just want to acknowledge, I mean, some of the more interesting and difficult things that they're surfaced by that exercise that we're not now spending time on, and I know that's highly unsatisfying to all of us. So I think if we can make some, even in the evaluation, just the notes on, is it worth spending some time talking about what are the common dysfunctions that we might run into, and how do you, let's bat around
That's
ideas
a
about
great
how do
idea.
you respond to that? Because I know some of us instinctively know that, but other times it's like, God, I never thought of that. Did that work? And those kind of
great
conversations, and even in smaller groups, might be really useful.
Yes. Maybe that's the next course. Common dysfunctions.
Well, one thing
How
that
do you
happened
do
in
it?
our group is that Ross had the description of being sort of difficult to be with, difficult to deal with, he didn't want me there, and so I was trying to break him down. Roger's charming, he's the board chair, so he's cracking all the jokes, so, and really the guy I should be helping or working with or relating to, and there are barriers when, how do you get yourself past these?
There's an absolute standard process to that.
And there's a real fiction about, the board is in charge legally speaking, but if you don't have your ED on board, it doesn't count. You can't remanage an organization through exclusively the board, unless the board is saying already, we're letting the ED go and we're rebuilding leadership. Or, so there's some things that are sort of, there's the fictional structure, and then there's the actual operational reality, which is much messier. And I think some of that stuff is where we could spend some time too. So.
That's a great course. I think that would be the next one.
I mean, many of us I know have seen boards that know they should they need to change leadership, but no one wants to take that on because they know how much work it means if they seriously want to go there.
I want to thank you all for coming, for your attention, for being good participants, and I hope it was worth your time. And, I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure Jeff.
Enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think you have got active in any of the rest.
Oh, I gotta tell you, I wish I could have videoed it, and we could have put it on our website. YouTube it.
Roger wasn't acting, he's just as charming by nature. He just was,
Roger said.
In
told
small
us-
doses.
Roger told us our job as SVP was to find someone on his board who was old, rich, and had no heirs. That's hysterical.
It needed to be a video.
It wasn't a joke.
But it was so great because you really took the power by just
let me just mention one other thing in closing. Thank you again for coming. I think it was a great first step in our training process. Behind the feedback sheet is the last sheet, and it's, what do you do now? What's the next steps? So we're talking about it. Certainly one of them is we want to be able to have information on partners so that when a team is being formed, we have somebody who has an expertise in a particular area and we know their availability, we can get them. So on this sheet, it gives you step-by-step of where to go on the website, the My Sites on the SVP website. And if you would fill that out or make sure it's up to date, that'd be very helpful for us, and that'd help ensure your position on a team. Second is your passion. Where is your passion? So again, the affinity groups are in the process of doing their scan. It's already happening. So I encourage you, here's their schedules, their contacts, the chairs. If you're interested and you're not involved in an affinity group now, this is a great guide to putting your foot in the water, seeing which one you like the most, and then pursuing your passion. And then the third thing, what are we talking about? What additional skills, support, and training do you want to have? So this is guided by the partners. This isn't our agenda, it's your agenda. So please feel free in your feedback to tell us, and we'll make sure it gets done. Thank you.
Thank you.